Audio lecture of Unit 2, Rise of Civilizations, River Valleys. Rise of Civilization. A. The transformation of human societies. Reliable and abundant food supplies allowed people in agricultural and pastoral communities that we discussed in the last unit to live longer, with higher rates of reproduction, and that causes populations to grow very quickly. More food equals more people. Global human population in around 8000 BC, which was the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, beginning of agriculture, was at about 5 million people. And by 600 BC, the beginning of the classical era that we'll go into in the next part of the course, it was at least 120 million. That is a significant growth in the human population. As populations increased, specialized occupations also developed. Things like merchants and artisans, builders, priests, and warriors. Job specialization also led to a hierarchy of social classes in both agricultural and pastoral communities. This is including an elite class with greater wealth, power, and privileges. Patriarchal social systems revealed emerging gender differences as well, as men became more dominant over women in most societies. Men were responsible for agriculture now, as well as the animals, domesticating those animals, while women moved inside to perform domestic tasks like raising the children and cooking. Some pastoralists acquired great wealth through trade, trading things such as animal hides and dairy products. Agriculturalists became more powerful than pastoralists, however, because of land ownership and permanent settlements. The accumulation of property now means the accumulation of wealth. A pattern of peaceful trade and violent encounters between the agriculturalists and the pastoralists emerged as a result of this. Now let's talk about some technological innovations. Innovations in technology led to improvements in agricultural production, in trade, and in transportation, especially what you see pictured here, the wheel. Pottery making was perhaps the first specialized craft to develop. Pottery was used to create containers in order to store and cook food, but eventually to hold other items as well. And this is why the wheel was so important. The wheel was used to help create pottery, the pottery wheel. Plows also will be developed, and they enable humans to cultivate more land, and they greatly increased agricultural productivity. To dig into the earth deeper with the plow, and to allow for the planting of seeds to be done more quickly as a result. Woven textiles, which means cloth, was created by using spindles to twist plant fibers or flax and animal fibers like wool or silk into thread, and looms were used to turn the thread into cloth. Looms would weave the threads together, forming the cloth. These are all new technological innovations that happen during this Neolithic period. Wheels, as I said before, were the most important early technology. First used to make pottery, as I said, and eventually as vehicles to get items from one place to another, and eventually help with trade. Metallurgy also developed, with copper being first. Metal was mined, heated, and then hammered into shapes to make tools, weapons, and jewelry. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin together, led to greater technological improvements. Bronze was harder and sharper than copper on its own. When you mix the copper with tin, you create bronze, and you create a sharper and harder surface that can be used for better weapons. Civilization's common characteristics now. Civilization defined. These here are the criteria for civilization that historians have come up with, and each of these will be discussed in more detail as we go through this section of the lecture. Okay, so first and foremost, it's agriculture. Agriculture allowed for settled communities, which allowed for civilizations to begin over time. We then have the development of urban centers or cities. Cities are different than villages because they contain monumental architecture or central architecture that is for the benefit of all in the society, not just small huts that people live in. Social stratification is the next one, which includes political and military systems developing, as well as economic specialization, which allowed for classes to develop with the ownership of property. Then we have organized religion, or specific practices, religious practices. And then we have communications, which of course leads us to the most important thing, writing. Writing really is the designation, the last criteria of civilization that was fulfilled. Writing was used for trade records, but then eventually for other things like historical records. And of course, this leads us to the development of a higher culture. Different kinds of technology can develop, engineering, mathematics, science, art, all of that. As I said, all of these will be discussed in greater detail as you go through the rest of this lecture. Starting about 5,000 years ago, urban societies laid the foundations of the first civilizations. Some of these were dealt with in the earlier unit. Catalhayuk comes to mind. Foundational civilizations were much bigger and denser than early farming communities. This is when we move from having something called a village to something called a city, and therefore a basic criteria, one of the criteria for civilization. The term civilization normally is used to designate large societies with cities and eventually powerful states. Despite their differences, each foundational civilization was alike in significant ways. As you see the red spots on the map here, you see the different areas where civilization started, and most all of them start in river valleys. All societies were centered around cities. By around 2250 BC, 8 cities around the globe had populations of 30,000. And by 1200 BC, it was 16 cities that had that large of a population. All of these civilizations had agricultural surpluses, and these surpluses freed some people to be able to specialize in non-agricultural activities. All of these civilizations also developed complex institutions like centralized government, laws, armies or the military, and religious hierarchies or organized religions, as discussed with the criteria of civilization. All of them developed social hierarchies, including an elite class, and saw clear gender differences emerging as well. All of these societies also developed forms of written records and more sophisticated forms of art, architecture, and eventually engineering. All also had sophisticated economic organizations with increased trade within and between civilizations and pastoralist communities. As populations grew and cities turned into states, competition for surplus resources, especially food and land, will lead to increased conflict within and between those civilizations, which means war. States were powerful new systems of rule that mobilized surplus labor and resources over large areas. The word state can also be exchanged for the word nation or kingdom or empire. They are all basically the same kind of entity, just different varying sizes. Rulers of each state often claimed divine connections to power and enjoyed military support. We'll discuss this as we go through the specific examples of these early civilizations. States in geographically advantageous areas developed complex trade networks and eventually sought to expand their territories by conquering nearby states. This is what we call empire building, or sometimes is called imperialism. Core and foundational civilizations develop in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus River Valley, the Huanghe River Valley, Mesoamerica, and the Andes of South America. The Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, of course the Egyptians in Egypt, the Mohenjo and the Harappan civilizations in the Indus River Valley, the Jia and Shang in the Huanghe River Valley, the Olmecs in Mesoamerica, and the Chavan in the Andes of South America. Now we'll discuss examples of early civilizations. This is also known as the Bronze Age. The Sumerians, like we talked about, the Egyptians, the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa civilizations, the Jia and Shang, the Olmecs, and the Chavan. We'll discuss some of these in the following slides. Others will be discussed in later units. Let's start with Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word, actually. That's because the Greeks were the first historians, so we use their words a lot. But Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. And it was located in Southwest Asia, or what is now known as the Middle East, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates river valleys can be seen here on this map. Mesopotamia is part of what is known as the Fertile Crescent, which stretches from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east. You see it located here in the pink. And there's where it's located on the earth, a crescent shape. Rivers provided abundant water and fertile silt for nearby plains, despite unpredictable and damaging floods. The problem with the rivers here was that they were unpredictable in when they would flood. You never knew from one year to the next if you were going to have too much water or not enough water, which caused feast and famine to happen regularly in Mesopotamian societies. In about 5000 BC, the first agricultural settlements in the area of Mesopotamia cultivated mostly wheat, barley, and domesticated sheep, goats, pigs, and cows. It's important to remember that when we use the word Mesopotamia at this point, we're talking about the geographic region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Fertile Crescent. We're not talking about a specific kingdom or state at this point. There will be several Mesopotamian states that are independent of each other. So Mesopotamia is primarily a geographical term telling you where these civilizations existed. Farmers in the Mesopotamian civilizations created irrigation systems to open new lands to cultivation. This was part of the process of creating civilizations, controlling your food source by controlling the water source as much as you possibly could. Now, society in Mesopotamian states. The religion in most of these states will be polytheistic, and religion dominated life. Remember, polytheistic means many gods. Society was primarily patriarchal, with men being revered as dominant in society. The economy in most states was based on farming, but they also had significant trade within the states and between the states, the different states. There were about 3 real social classes that existed: the royal or priestly classes with their families, the commoners, and then below them the slaves. And most slaves came from one of 2 places: either from a war where other people were conquered and prisoners of war were taken and they became slaves, or debtors' slavery. People who could not pay their debts, their taxes, what have you, could be forced into debtors' slavery. Now, going to the right side of the page here, warfare was common in these Mesopotamian states. Wars between these states often too. Each of these city-states, or city kingdoms as we will call them, oftentimes they were all autonomous, governing themselves, and they often fought with each other over territory or over trade and other reasons. Some of this could have something to do with the geography. Since the rivers flooded so irregularly and unpredictably, there was a lot of anxiety and pessimism. Why? Well, the rivers, because they were unpredictable, many thought that meant that the gods that were in control of nature were upset with the people. And this would cause friction between the communities. Sometimes one community, one state, would attack another state. And if they did attack them and were successful, then it was seen that their gods were successful in defeating the gods of the defeated people. So the geography of the region, the unpredictable rivers, the sometimes droughts that they had because of that, and famines, ultimately are factors in how these societies develop, how their cultures develop. They were a more anxious and pessimistic society because they believed that the gods were constantly punishing them for things, because the gods, controlled nature. So if nature was unpredictable, the gods must be capricious or easily upset. Yes, it was a patriarchal society. Remember, patriarchy basically means rule of the father. There was a double standard of sexual morality in most of these Mesopotamian states, yet there were some possibilities of social mobility for women. Some women in some Mesopotamian states, societies, become court advisors, temple priestesses, and even participated in economic activity. If their husbands were tradesmen, they sometimes would work with their husbands in the trade. Here is Sumer, or the Sumerian civilization in the southern part of Mesopotamia. It's one of the first ones we'll discuss. Here's an excavated site at Ur, which was a Sumerian city-state. Ur, of course, was the land where Abraham of Judaism came from originally, before he sojourned away from Mesopotamia and went to the promised land of Canaan, where God directed him. Here's the standard of Ur. This is a sculpture of sorts that shows 3 rows depicting the 3 social classes. You're going to be doing a workbook page that uses this as one of your sources. It shows royal priests at the top. It shows commoners in the middle and slaves at the bottom. One side of it also depicts war, and the other side depicts peace. Above here, you see the war panel, and on the next slide, you see the peace panel. You see the war panel because you see the weapons, you see the horses, and the destruction going on. And here's the peace panel. Sumerian city-states. Okay, so these Sumerian city-states dominate the region in southern Mesopotamia from around 3200 to 2350 BC. And a ziggurat was one of the monumental architectural buildings that was built by the Sumerians. A ziggurat is kind of a stepped pyramid of sorts, and they were oftentimes used for temples as well as the center of society of the city-state, almost like the town hall, if you will, or the city hall. Ziggurats were seen to be the home of the gods. The one you see here is what's left of the ziggurat at Uruk. Irrigation systems were also part of the monumental building projects that were taken on. Defense from nomadic marauders was also necessary, since they often went to war with other city-states and often had other pastoral or nomadic marauders coming in and trying to invade their cities. So walls were very important to be built around city-states for protection, for defensive purposes. Warfare was very common, so walls would help protect you during these times of war. And of course, most all of the kings in these city-states were absolute in their power base, absolute monarchies. Here's the great walls of Uruk, what's left of them. You can see them stretched out in the back there as well. Here's a reconstruction of what they think the ziggurat at Ur looked like. Yes, it was a theocratic society because the kings had a connection to the gods. The kings usually came about as originally part of the priestly class. Because of their connection to the gods, they were seen to have some kind of power, and therefore they gained political power as well. The development of writing, the first writing system that we have found as historians, is the writing in Sumer. Around 2900 BC, or roughly 3000, the Sumerians create a writing system known as cuneiform, which really means wedge-shaped. The uses for writing, well, of course, trade. Trade was probably the most important thing. They had to keep trade records, and that's why they had to develop a system of writing. They had thousands of shapes that would be pressed with a reed into wet clay tablets, and they needed to keep the records. And so each character represented a different idea or a different word, and thousands of them had to be memorized in order to master this writing system. It was very clunky and very difficult to master. Eventually, writing would be used for other purposes, including literature and keeping track of historical records. Probably the earliest example of literature we have that was written in cuneiform was the Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled sometime after the year 2000 BC. And the summary is basically a king that had a connection to the gods, had the gods on his side, who built the walls around the city, eventually goes for on an adventure trying to look for the key to everlasting life, because the only thing he doesn't have is immortality. And of course, he discovers after a long journey that he too will die like everyone on earth, that he is not a god, even if he is seen to have a connection to the gods. But his legacy can be in how good of a king he was to his people, including building those walls that help protect their city. Here are two fragments of cuneiform on clay tablets, so you can see what it looks like. Now, Mesopotamian empires will also rise as the city-states of Sumer, or the Sumerian city-states, declined. Empires are different because empire means that one area was taken over by another. and created an empire, ruling it from afar. So, an empire is when one city state conquers another and adds it to its territory. The first of the Mesopotamian empires happens between 2370 and 2315 BC when Sargon of Akkad, who was the king of the Akkadians, takes over large portions of the Sumerian city-states. Now, I have cultural diffusion written there because, of course, the Akkadians will adopt a lot of the Sumerian culture and adapt it to their own. Adoption and adaptation. Cultural diffusion as a major theme in this course is something we'll talk about over and over again. The Akkadians adopted, for example, cuneiform writing, and they adapted it to their own spoken language. We also will see the creation of another empire after the Akkadians, or the Akkadians, called the Empire of Babylon. This, of course, begins under the rule of Hammurabi, the emperor of Babylon. Hammurabi of Babylon lived between 1792 and 1750 BC. Remember, BC, the timeline looks to go backwards. And he is known specifically for his code of law. He is one of the earliest that we have found of a written code of law. And codifying the law is extremely important for civilization because it provides order for society. Written codes of law, we'll talk about over and over again in this course, are significant because they provide order for society and they show us that the law is no longer arbitrary. It is written literally in stone and cannot be ignored as a result of that. So the Code of Hammurabi was given to him, he argued, by the gods. His connection to the gods, rulers were seen to have a connection with the gods. And it was based on a concept known as lex talionis. Lex talionis means the law of retaliation. Okay? The Code of Hammurabi is where we get the terms eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which means the punishment will fit the crime. For every crime, there was a punishment designated. However, it did depend on your social status, which kind of punishment you received. So, yes, it was written in stone that you would receive X punishment for X crime, but it depended upon which social class you were in as well. In addition to this relief showing you the god Shamash giving the law to Hammurabi, it sets forth the law code for all to see by writing it on this stele. This stele was erected in the center of the city of Babylon as a representation of the law, a physical representation of the law. Even though the majority of the people in society couldn't read it, it didn't matter. It was a physical representation of the power of the king and the power of the law. The Babylonian Empire will later be destroyed by a group called the Hittites from Anatolia, or from modern-day Turkey, around 1595 BC. We'll talk more about that later. Here are two images of Hammurabi. It was said, the son of Babylon, the king who has made the four quarters of the world subservient. He ruled from 1792 to around 1750 BC. Here's a model of the city of Babylon that was built during Hammurabi's reign. And what jumps out to you, of course, is that ziggurat right there in the center. Some historians argue that perhaps this ziggurat was the infamous Tower of Babel that we read about in the Old Testament. Perhaps. Later Iron Age empires, now we're going to talk about in the Fertile Crescent, people like the Assyrians, the Chaldeans also. known as the Neo-Babylonians. Okay, so you have the Hammurabi Babylonians, the Old Babylonians, and then you have the Neo-Babylonians, which were also known as the Chaldeans. Let's first of all talk about the Assyrians. The Assyrian Emperor Ashurbanipal was the greatest of all Assyrian emperors. The Assyrian Empire was unrivaled in its cruel, ruthless methods of warfare. This is how they came to dominate the Fertile Crescent, bringing an end to the earlier Bronze Age civilizations like Babylon and the Akkadians. This stela depicts an Assyrian archer. They were known for their ferocity in warfare and their harsh treatment of those that they conquered. Assyrian propaganda you see here. Ashurbanipal and his wife are banqueting in their royal garden. And you see down below a closer look are captives being impaled by Sennacherib's army. They would put this kind of propaganda up for all to see to show themselves as fierce in order to keep the people in line. This could happen to you if you did not submit to the authority of the Assyrians when you were conquered. Now let's talk about the Chaldeans, also known as the Neo-Babylonians. Of course, this is the Neo-Babylonians or the Chaldeans are the ones that you learn about in the Old Testament when you go through the period of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, etc. Babylon takes advantage of the internal descent to create this new Babylonian or Chaldean empire, roughly 600 to 562 BC. So this is much later. The Hebrews would be held captive once again. They had been held captive by the Assyrians. They had been held captive by the Persians, whom we'll talk about later. And now they're also being held captive by the Neo-Babylonians. There are a couple of links to videos that you can watch to see some of that, including VeggieTales, Rack, Shack, and Benny, which I love. Now we're going to move on to Egypt in the Nile River Valley. Around 3000 BC, agriculture developed on the small fertile strip along the Nile River in Egypt. Egypt, therefore, is called the gift of the Nile. As you can see, it is a very narrow strip of fertile land just along the banks of the river, not spreading out very far beyond it, because the area around it is pretty much desert with very little rainfall. This area around the Nile River is known as the Black Land because it is so fertile. And of course, the land beyond that is known as the Red Land because it is the more desert-like land. And the Delta region that you see marked here is where the mouth of the river empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And it's called a delta because it's shaped like a triangle or the delta letter of the Greek alphabet. The predictable annual flooding of the Nile deposited fertile soil, allowing farming to flourish in the region. This is a marked contrast from what we saw in Mesopotamia, with those rivers being so unpredictable in their flooding. Because the river in Egypt flooded so regularly, it allowed for the farmers to be able to plan when to plant and when to harvest a whole lot easier. And this, of course, will make for more steady population growth and far less trouble with famine. Herodotus wrote, the Greek historian wrote, "When the Nile inundates or floods, the land of Egypt becomes a sea, and only the towns remain above water. At such times, shipping no longer follows the stream, but goes straight across the country. Anyone, for example, traveling from Naucratis to Memphis, these are both cities in Egypt, sails right alongside the pyramids. The three Egyptian seasons. The inundation is the time of the flood, and it happens between June and September. An Egyptian hymn states, "If the Nile smiles, the earth is joyous. Every stomach is full of rejoicing. Every spine is happy. Every jawbone crushes its food." In other words, it provides plenty for the population. The emergence of the fields from the water is the second of the Egyptian seasons. Begins in October, leaving the fields very moist. And the third season is the drought, although it is not truly a drought like we saw in times of famine. The drought is just the time when the river beds dry up, and it's from February until June. It is during the dry season that the Egyptian population did other public works for the pharaoh, their king. Egyptians grew grains and also fruits and vegetables. The very fertile soil allowed for a very predictable growing season and very plentiful harvests. For this reason, Egypt was oftentimes referred to as the breadbasket of the ancient world. And this is why in Exodus, in Genesis, at the end of Genesis and moving into Exodus, we see that the Hebrew population in a time of famine ends up getting enslaved in Egypt. By the time we get to Exodus, of course, they are exiting Egypt. But many peoples flocked to Egypt during times of famine. The Egyptian irrigation was far more sophisticated than it was in Mesopotamia as well. They had a system known as basin irrigation, which utilized a series of dikes and canals to extend the farmlands far beyond the Nile. They could direct the water through these channels with these dikes and canals to get the water to other crops that weren't right on the banks of the Nile. This led to even more fertile soil and more crops being able to be grown. The Egyptians also domesticated goats, sheep, pigs, cattle, and geese. The impact of the Nile on Egyptian society and political organization. Egyptian history is divided up into a number of kingdom periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. What is the most important thing to recognize about all of these periods of Egyptian history is that they are characterized by continuity. Things do not change a great deal. Things remain similar, and this led to stability for the people living in Egypt. Now, as in Mesopotamia, a need for formal organization existed. They needed to maintain order and organize community projects. In Egypt, it was much more simple to do so due to the local irrigation projects and due to the fact that the Nile flooded on a regular basis. It flooded at the same time every year. You could almost set your watch by it. Even though they didn't have watches, they knew when it was going to flood and they could plan accordingly. And they could utilize basins to trap water for dry periods when it was needed as well. Egyptian was a heavily rural society rather than a heavily urban society. Not a lot of urban development. There were some cities, but not a lot of urban development. Most of it was an agrarian or agricultural society. Trade networks will develop, though, because travel along the Nile River would be fairly easy to navigate. During the pre-dynastic period, Upper and Lower Egypt were not yet united. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt happened between 3100 and 2700 BC. Now, just so everybody knows, Upper Egypt is actually in the south, and Lower Egypt is in the north. And the reason why it seems backwards is because the Nile flowed from the south to the north, kind of like the St. John's River does. So Upper Egypt was upriver, which was in the south, and Lower Egypt was downriver, which was in the north. Here are some maps of the Old Kingdom. 2686 to 2181 BC is the time period known as the Old Kingdom period. It is also known as the Pyramid Age because that is when most of those massive pyramids were built by the pharaohs as their elaborate tombs. The capital city was at Memphis, right near the beginning of the Nile Delta. Now, the unification of Egypt that did happen with the beginning of the Old Kingdom happened largely due to a legendary conqueror named Menes, also sometimes referred to as Narmer. This happened around 3100 BC, and it unified the Egyptian kingdom, unified Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. Now, we still don't say that the Old Kingdom really takes hold until 2660 BC, but we do give Menes credit for starting that process of unification. This is when we see the rule of the pharaoh instituted. The pharaohs, or the kings, claimed to have descent from the gods. As a matter of fact, they were considered gods themselves. Pharaoh meant divine kingship, God king. They didn't just have a connection with the gods in the minds of the people, they actually were gods. The power of the pharaoh was most intense or most powerful during the Archaic period between 3100 and 2660 BC and during the Old Kingdom period that followed. Now, the relations with the people living to the south of Egypt, Nubia, do come into effect during this period. There was a lot of military conflict between Egypt and Nubia in that Archaic period, the 3100 to 2600 BC time period. It is during this period that the Nubians were driven further south, upriver, if you will, into the upper part of the Nile, even though that's in the south. And the Nubians will eventually establish the kingdom of Kush around 2500 BC. This is when, of course, we see the beginning of the Old Kingdom period after pushing the Nubians further south. And this is the dawn of what we will sometimes call the Pyramid Age. Here is a palette of Narmer or Menes showing the conquering of the Nubian people. The Middle Kingdom period comes next. The Middle Kingdom, 2040 to 1800 BC, is where the capital is moved to Thebes, which is a further south or upriver from where it had been before. Now, what had happened between the end of the Old Kingdom period and the beginning of the Middle Kingdom period was a period known as the First Intermediate period. And this was when pharaonic power, meaning the power of the pharaohs, went by the wayside for a while. It was a time of disturbance. It was a time of trouble. And it was a time when Egypt was not united between the north and the south. It will only last a small while, less than a century, and then pharaonic power is restored. The pharaohs were seen as the good shepherd of the people. And the concept of Ma'at, as you see here, was reinstated. Now, Ma'at basically means that the pharaoh was in charge of instilling cosmic harmony and social justice in the world. Cosmic harmony meaning that the pharaoh had the connection to the gods, and so the cosmic harmony between the earth and the heavens was there due to the pharaoh. And the social justice part of Ma'at meant that he would make sure that the people on earth got along and maintained their social peace because of his actions on earth. The afterlife during the Middle Kingdom was also democratized. prior to this, the concept of mummification, which the Egyptians were known for, wrapping the body very carefully to preserve it for use in the afterlife, was only really for the kings and the nobles. By the time we get into the Middle Kingdom period, we see that changing, and the afterlife is democratized, meaning that if you had the money to pay for it, you too could be mummified to save your body so you could use it in the afterlife. Hieroglyphs are also an important thing when it comes to Egyptian history, and we see them developing in the Old Kingdom period, but really becoming very sophisticated as we move into the Middle and New Kingdom periods. Hieroglyphs were known as holy inscriptions. It is the system of writing in Egypt. It is a pictographic system of writing that is supplemented with symbols representing sounds and ideas. This is important because, as we discussed with the Mesopotamians, the system of writing is extremely important for society to be able to keep records, trade records, and then, governmental records, historical records, records for taxation, if you will. These are all very important for a developed civilization. But also, we see in Egypt, they develop a different kind of surface to write on rather than just the clay tablets, which oftentimes were very heavy and not very portable that we had in Mesopotamia. In Egypt, they developed papyrus. They took reeds from the Nile River, wove them together, and pounded them very flat, getting the water out of them. And this ultimately created a kind of paper that they could roll up into scrolls, and it was very portable, and it lasted longer as a result of that. Did not break if it was dropped, if you will. So the Egyptians developing the first kind of paper, if you will. Now, the Rosetta Stone that dates to about 196 BC, so it's about 1,000 years past where we are now, but the reason this is important, it was found in 196 BC, it was found later, it was found in 1799, dates back carbon dating to 196 BC. The reason this is important is because this is what has allowed historians to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's been discovered that the same text in three languages is written on this, and one of the languages is Greek. Since Greek had been deciphered already, the Greek and the Demotic Egyptian allowed for historians to decipher the traditional hieroglyphics as well. So this, of course, will be a big find, historical find that happened in 1799 as Napoleon's troops invaded Egypt. It would be translated by 1822. It is now housed at the British Museum. It's quite large and it's quite impressive. This is the Valley of the Kings, which became a new burial place for the pharaohs of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom period, rather than the elaborate pyramids, which got robbed very often. The idea was to fool the grave robbers, and will see this carries on into the New Kingdom period as well. The New Kingdom pharaohs will try to hide their tombs. And so far, anthropologists and archaeologists have discovered 62 tombs excavated in this general area. There's also a Valley of the Queens that has been found. Now, the Middle Kingdom is known also as the golden age of Egyptian history. Building projects shift from building these great pyramids, which were like grand tombs for the pharaohs, which required a lot of work, very labor intensive, pretty impressive how large they are and how they were able to build them so efficiently. But those building projects will shift to more infrastructure projects during the Middle Kingdom period. And these infrastructure projects made Egypt more even more productive. Irrigation projects, canals being dug, and even eventually starting to build more cities. Southern expansion into Kush and Nubia also happened during this time period where they conquered more territories. Yes, they had pushed the Nubians down in south before, but now they pushed them even further. And if anybody knows the story of the opera Aida, which has been remade into a kind of a musical several a couple of decades ago by Disney's. Actually, the music was written by Elton John. It's very good. That story is when it takes place during the Middle Kingdom when the fighting goes on between the Egyptians and the Nubians once again, and the Nubians lose their homeland. There are a great number of powerful noble families that will become dominant during the Middle Kingdom period. They become the bureaucrats for the pharaohs, and they wield a lot of power as a result of that. However, by around 1800 BC, a second intermediate period happens, which of course means once again you have a break in the continuity. The pharaonic power in a united Egypt fades, and this is because Lower Egypt, which is in the north, is invaded. It is overrun and becomes a separate Hyksos kingdom. The Hyksos are a group of people who were the first people that were really able to invade Egypt effectively because of their use of chariots, bronze chariots. Now, Egypt had always been fairly well protected by the geography of the region, having desert on either side. It was very difficult to invade it. It was difficult to invade from the south because of the cataracts or the river rapids in the Nile River. And so, therefore, they didn't have to build a lot of walls and things to protect them from invasion like the Mesopotamian city-states did. They had the natural geographic protection that kept invaders at bay until the Hyksos figured out that they could get across that desert a whole lot faster without, dying of thirst or starvation like most had done before that tried to invade Egypt because they developed a chariot. And so this allowed them to get across the desert more quickly. During this period, the Hyksos, like I say, they take over half of Egypt. The lower part of Egypt, which is in the north, will become a separate Hyksos kingdom, and Upper Egypt in the south will still be under the pharaoh's power. It will still be Egypt, but it's not a united Egypt, meaning north and south are united. So that's why we call this the second intermediate period. A series of weak pharaohs were not able to restore the unity to Egypt or expel the Hyksos during the second intermediate period until, well, the new kingdom is founded around 1570 BC, lasting until 1100 BC, and this happens because of the pharaoh Amosis. Amosis was the pharaoh in the upper part of Egypt that was able to finally copy the chariots of the Hyksos, build them for his own army, and then use them against the Hyksos to retake Lower Egypt and reunite the two halves of Egypt. After Amosis reunites Egypt, the new kingdom pharaohs that follow will engage in a series of empire building projects, meaning rather than not trying to expand outward beyond the Nile River, that policy will change. Instead of being isolated like they had been during the Old and Middle Kingdom periods. In order to not allow anybody to be able to invade them again, they attempt to create a buffer zone between themselves and those that might try to move in and take Egypt. So they instead take over territories all along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. And you see there, all that in red becomes part of what it will be their empire. We will see also that one of the most infamous of the New Kingdom pharaohs is Ramses II, who was the pharaoh during the exodus of the Israelites. It will be during the New Kingdom period that the Egyptians take the Israelites captive first of all, and then finally the Israelites will receive their freedom by escaping through the Red Sea, as we know, and into the land of Canaan, back to their promised land that the Lord had promised them. Now, Egyptian culture, there were major cities along the Nile River, especially at the delta, meaning the top part. There are well defined social classes as well. Pharaohs, of course, are the kings, all the way down to slaves. Many different levels in society, well defined social classes, pharaohs and priestly class and nobility and middle class tradesmen and such, and then moving on down to the slaves. Um, Patriarchal, it was very patriarchal in its makeup, the society's makeup. There were a couple of notable exceptions. There was one female pharaoh in particular, Hatshepsut. There was a lot of economic specialization in the Egyptian urban culture that develops during especially this New Kingdom period. So they had left their traditionally just agrarian ways and developed a more urban culture. Bronze metallurgy was introduced with the Hyksos invasion, and they will, of course, eventually develop iron fairly early, around 900 BC, ushering in the Iron Age period. Trade along the Nile River was more difficult to the south. For those that lived in the south, like the Nubians in Kush, but along the river in Egypt, they were able to harness the wind power coming from the Mediterranean Sea to go upriver, means to go south, and then use the current of the Nile River to go downriver, meaning go north. So trade between the different regions of Egypt actually worked fairly easily. It's just beyond Egypt where it got more and more difficult due to the cataracts. Sea trade in the Mediterranean becomes very important for Egyptian culture as well. They control a lot of the trade along the Mediterranean area for a while because of their location on the Mediterranean, since the Nile River opens into the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea will be basically a major trade highway in the ancient world, and he who can control the coastline of the Mediterranean can ultimately control a lot of wealth and power. As we will see as we go through different civilizations, we're going to talk about the importance of this Mediterranean Sea and the control of trade on it. New Kingdom pharaohs of note, of course, one of them I mentioned just briefly before there was one woman pharaoh. Her name was Hatshepsut. Even though you see her portrayed, the gray picture there in with a beard, that was a traditional thing how pharaohs were portrayed. Um, Ultimately, becomes the Pharaoh because her husband died before their son Tutmos was able to rule outright himself. So she ruled kind of as his regent for a while, but actually ruled outright. Tutmos will be a fairly important pharaoh as well. Another important pharaoh during the New Kingdom period will be Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaton. He reigned from 1353 to 1335 BC. Now, he's not so much of an important ruler because of how he ruled, but because of what he tried to do with the religion in Egypt. Egypt, just like we saw with most of these ancient Bronze Age societies, was a polytheistic culture, belief in many gods, one of which was the pharaoh himself. Um, And they believed their gods were very benevolent and kind to them because the river floodings were so predictable and they were able to produce plenty of food. They had lots of peace for a long time with no invasions, as I said, until the end of the Middle Kingdom period. But anyways, the point being, they believed in these gods. They believed that they were blessing them constantly. But what happened was that Akhenaton, or Amenhotep, who changes his name to Akhenaton, decided that he wanted his principal god to be recognized as the most important of all of the gods. Now, his principal god was Aten. Okay, so this is why he changes his name to Akhenaton, which basically means one who serves Aten, or Ten. Now, he tried to do this. Now, this was not really monotheism. He didn't say that the other gods didn't exist, but he did say that his primary god, Aten, should be worshipped as the most important god. And this is known as henotheism, a preference for one god over all of the others, but not necessarily discounting the existence of the other gods. So it's not really monotheism like we will see with the Hebrews, which we'll talk about later on in the unit. The death of Akhenaton, however, was something that the people of Egypt actually rejoiced in because they did not like their other gods being dissed, if you will, especially the priests to the other gods. They thought that this was blasphemy on the part of the Pharaoh, and they did not like it. And even though he technically was worshipped as a god himself because he was Pharaoh, it does not mean that he was very well liked. And so when he died, they were kind of glad. The traditional priests restore the cult of Amun-Re to privileged status, as well as the other deities like Ptah and Osiris and Isis, and basically the religion turned back to regular Egyptian polytheism. Another pharaoh that you may have heard of from the New Kingdom period is Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut. Was a boy king, did not live very long, did not rule for very long. Most historians believe that he was either killed, poisoned, or he died of some kind of disease. There's some speculation out there on that. But the point that his reign was so short was a tragedy, and we have a lot of artifacts from King Tut because his gravesite was found in the 19th century pretty much intact. Grave robbers had never found it. It was in the Valley of the Kings. It had been hidden well. And so a lot of the artifacts now are in the British Museum, so you can see them, including this glorious golden death mask that you see down the bottom left-hand corner. And of course, we have Ramses II on the bottom right-hand corner, who is the pharaoh when the exodus of the Israelites happened. So he is famous, or rather infamous, for that. The mysterious sea people, however, seem to have some kind of impact on the decline, finally, of Egyptian society at the end of the New Kingdom period. Um, there seems to be a trend of a group of people coming from the sea and bringing about the decline of the traditional Bronze Age cultures, including those in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Who were these people? We're not really sure. Did they cause some kind of chain reaction? We call it sometimes the catastrophe period. This around between 1100 and 900 BC, there seems to be a series of catastrophes happening throughout the Bronze Age world, bringing about the end of these old Bronze Age civilizations and making room for new ones. It helped also, bring about the end of the New Kingdom period. We just aren't really sure who these people are, but we do know that eventually there will be a shift in in civilizations. And will usher in the Iron Age with the Iron Age civilizations. Now let's talk a little bit about another important early civilization, the Hebrews, and the emergence of the first monotheism, the belief in one God. And as we know, the one true God, because Christianity, of course, is born out of the Hebrew faith as a fulfillment of the prophecy for the Messiah. All right, so intro to the Hebrews, of course. They are a spiritual people. They had been for years nomadic pastoralists. Okay, so we've learned about pastoral civilizations. They were herdsmen. They traveled from place to place with their herds, and not extensive agriculturalists initially. The 12 tribes of the Hebrews were started off as nomadic pastoralists. We know that eventually some of them end up migrating into Egypt, where they will come into captivity under the Egyptians. Eventually, they will be liberated under the leadership of Moses from their captivity in Egypt during the Exodus period. And eventually, they move back into their promised land of Palestine, okay, Canaan or Palestine. Then they will establish their king period, their kingdom period. Jerusalem, of course, being the capital city that would be built by King David. The nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, will take the southern portion eventually of the kingdom, and Judah, the two tribes that end up as part of the of Judah, will be in the other portion. Then eventually they will come under the captivity of several other civilizations through the early times, including, of course, the Romans. By the time they are under the captivity of the Romans, they will be dispersed in what is known as the diaspora into other parts of the Roman Empire, which spreads them all throughout not just the Middle East on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean where they had started, but all throughout Asia Minor, all throughout Northern Europe, North and Western Europe as well. This right here that you see is a mosaic of the 12 tribes of Israel that were, of course, named for the 12 children of Jacob. Okay, so the Hebrews timeline. Let's look at the timeline a little bit. As we know, Abraham, and some of this you will have covered in your Bible classes. So I'm not going to go through it as in detail as you would have in a Bible class, but as in a history class, it is important to recognize who the Hebrew people are for their historical relevance, but especially for their religious relevance. The dawn of monotheism, the beginning of monotheism, begins with the Hebrews. Of course, the one true God as well. Okay, so Abraham starts in Ur. That's one of those Sumerian city-states we discussed earlier. And eventually, he is called upon by his God, Yahweh, as he was referred to then. The one true God calls him to leave Ur, to leave the polytheistic ways of the Sumerian and Mesopotamian peoples. And he moves eventually northward. He gets to Nineveh. Then he goes westward to Haran, and then he eventually moves southward along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and eventually settles in the land of Canaan, which was the promised land promised to him by Yahweh. Palestine or Canaan was also an area inhabited by the Phoenicians as well. The northern part of the coastline was inhabited by the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians were also an important civilization during this Bronze Age period because Of course, they did a lot of trade along the Mediterranean Sea. They communicated with a lot of different cultures because of that trade. They became transmitters of culture because of their contact with so many different peoples. And they were the ones that developed an alphabet. The alphabet will be extremely important because instead of having a number of different, very complicated writing systems with thousands and thousands of symbols that you have to learn in order to master it, the Phoenicians came up with at the time, 22 letter alphabet. Each symbol in this alphabet represented a sound that you make when you speak, and every language was using the similar sounds. And so what they discovered is if we make a symbol for the sound, you can combine those symbols together as your words make different sounds, and you can eventually create the words with just 22 symbols. You only have to memorize 22 symbols, put them together in different combinations to make different words, and it was very adaptable to many of the Semitic languages that we see in this region. All of those Mesopotamian cultures were Semitic based languages. Even the Egyptian culture was a Semitic based language. So it was adaptable to all of them. So that's why the Phoenicians were important. Okay, so they were the neighbors to the north of the Hebrews along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean in the land of Canaan. Now, as we know, Yahweh was the patron deity of Abraham. We know that he is the one true God, the one true creator God. All the others are false. And eventually, because Abraham followed God's directions or Yahweh's directions, Yahweh is God the Father. His descendants will be able to inhabit this area of Canaan, this promised land, and they will become a great nation. Now, for a while, the 12 tribes that come of course, Isaac and then Jacob, would have the 12 tribes of the 12 sons of Jacob. Some of those tribes, excuse me, end up in captivity in Egypt. And eventually, they will be enslaved there for several generations. By around 1300, now this is about 550 years after Abraham, so this is many generations later. By 1300 or so, Moses was able to become the new leader of the Hebrew people and lead them out of captivity in Egypt during the Exodus. Once they return to Palestine, there will be some ongoing conflict with the indigenous populations that had inhabited that region since they had been in captivity. Ultimately, they will have to fight to gain back control over their promised land. Fight against Jericho and others comes to mind. And of course, the Philistines and all of that as well. You eventually will see that the nation of Israel will be founded, first starting with Saul in the 11th century. Then David between 1000 and 970 BC, and then of course his son Solomon between 970 and 930 BC, when the Temple of Solomon is built in the capital city of Jerusalem that David had built. Okay, so again, just in a nutshell, you get more details in your Bible class, but just in a nutshell, the Hebrew timeline. Here is a visual map of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. From its greatest extent under Solomon, the kingdom of Israel split into the rival northern and southern kingdoms, and then progressively lost ground against Assyria and Babylon, eventually coming under captivity of the Persians as well, and then of course also the Romans. God's covenant with Abraham. The word of the Lord came, saying, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said to him, So shall thy seed be. And Abraham believed the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Genesis 15:5 and 6. This, of course, also on the right is a statue done by Michelangelo of Moses. And by the way, that is how you say it. The Italians pronounce the I's like an E. So I know a lot of people say Michelangelo, but if you are in Italy, which is where he was from, they say Michelangelo. Anyhow, the covenant with God is the centerpiece of this monotheistic religion. Yahweh, God, makes a promise to Abraham and creates this covenant, this contract. I promise this. God never breaks his end of the covenant. Unfortunately, man breaks their end of the covenant many times, man being sinful. So Yahweh makes a promise to Abraham, I will give you this nation and will make a great nation of your people. And then, of course, he makes another covenant to Jacob. Your sons, your 12 sons, will be the heart of the nation, the 12 nations of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, excuse me. Then, of course, also to Noah, makes a covenant with Noah. I will never destroy the earth again. And sends the rainbow, etc. And then to Moses, I promise you can lead the Hebrew people out of their captivity in Egypt and back into their promised land if you follow my laws and my directions. If the Hebrews kept the covenant and obeyed Yahweh's laws, they would prosper as his chosen people. When the Hebrews were maintaining their end of the covenant, they were successful. When they broke it was when times of captivity came. So ultimately, that covenant is the heart of this faith that God keeps his promises to us. We must keep up our obedience to him in order for us to remain successful, for us to remain peace at peace. But even when we falter, God is always with us, and God is always there to accept us back, as he did with the Hebrews as well. Okay, Moses and the Exodus, of course, just to reinforce that covenant. Remember, Moses reinforced the concept of true monotheism after many of the Hebrews had fallen away during their captivity in Egypt and had started even worshiping the Egyptian gods. We know that some had also strayed even when they had followed Moses into the wilderness. But when he went up to Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments, they grew weary of waiting, and many of them started to build the golden calf, as we know, and that will. And when Moses sees this, he will break the commandments and have to go and get new ones. Anyhow, the point being, God was seen as a very personal God to the Hebrew people, to the Israelite people. By the way, those names can really be used interchangeably in a history class like this. They refer to themselves as the Israelites because they were the children of Israel. Israel, of course, comes from the name Jacob. Jacob in Yiddish or in Hebrew is Israel. But they become known as the Hebrews once they go into Egypt and are held captive there. The word Hebrew is an Egyptian word that means one who serves you. Anyways, for our purposes here, the names are pretty much interchangeable: Hebrews slash Israelites or children of Israel, and they will also be known as the Jews because they are the followers of Judaism, the religion. Okay, so a very personal God. Reward and punishment are given for conformity with the laws given to them. If you follow the laws of God, There are 10 basic ones to follow. You will receive reward as his chosen people. Um, Conformity is revealed with the law and recorded in the Torah as well. The Torah, the holy scriptures, the earliest of the holy scriptures of the Hebrew people. They, of course, the 10 Commandments are those laws. They will be referred to as Mosaic laws, oftentimes because they were the laws given to Moses by Yahweh, God Himself. And the Torah ultimately becomes the recording of the early Hebrew history and their relationship with Yahweh God is recorded there as well. Now, of the 10 Commandments, as you see here, it's interesting to take note how many of them deal with religion specifically, and how would you classify the others? Because they are very legalistic, many of them dealing with legal relationships between people, but others dealing with relationship between the people and God. Okay, so the religious ones and the legal ones all together in this group of 10. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Number 1. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Number 2. Number 3, of course, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Number 5, honor thy father and thy mother. Number 6, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. Number 8, thou shalt not steal. Number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And number 10, thou shalt not covet. It's interesting to consider how many of these deal with religion specifically and how many really deal with the legal practices between individuals. Relationships are what these commandments are about. The relationship that the Hebrew people have with God and the relationships that they have with each other. This is why we refer to this faith as one called ethical monotheism. It's not just monotheism, the belief in one God rather than many gods, but it's the ethical quality to it. And this is the greatest legacy left to history from the Israelite or Hebrew people. At the heart of the Hebrew religious belief is this ethical quality, and it's what sets it apart from all other ancient religions. It's this concept of ethical monotheism. We believe in the one true God, but we do have free will that has been given to us by our Creator. That free will gives us, it is up to us whether we will follow the laws of God and live a righteous life, or we will choose the other path and go away from God. The importance of the individual is stressed in this relationship. And this is something that God wanted when He created man. He wanted man to have the ability to make decisions, to use his ability to reason. He created us in His image. But He wants us, of course, to choose the righteous path. And if we follow Him, we will ultimately have success because we will eventually be reunited with Him. Now, foreign conquerors of Israel, some of these we've mentioned already. By around 722 BC, the Assyrians took control over the Israelite kingdom. This is after Solomon had built the temple in Jerusalem, and this is the first time after the creation of the kingdom of Israel, after, of course, the Exodus, that Israel is conquered and overrun by foreigners. Oftentimes, the Hebrews would be referred to as the people of the book because they were focused on that Torah, on that on their legal system, that which is also their religion in the Ten Commandments. Then, of course, about a century and a half or so after the Assyrians had conquered the the Israelites, the Babylonians, or really it was the Neo Babylonians or the Chaldeans came and conquered the Israelites. This is under the King Nebuchadnezzar that we talked about earlier in this unit. But what is significant about all these times that Israel is conquered by these foreign peoples is that the Israelites maintain their religious identity. They maintain their relationship with God, even though they may have broken the covenant, and that had been the times when the foreign conquerors were able to conquer Israel. Solomon allowed his some of his wives to maintain their polytheistic beliefs, and that was seen by many to be the beginning of these foreign conquerors of Israel, because um, he did not rebuke them for their polytheistic ways and force them to worship the one true God. Um, Anyways, the point being, always during these times of captivity, God would send prophets to the Israelite people, encouraging them to get back to basics, get back to their relationship with God, to trust God to deliver them out of this time of strife. And He always did. So they maintained their religious identity. Many were able to eventually return to Judea after being taken over by the Persians. The Persians were actually a lot more benevolent towards the Israelites, the Hebrews, and allowed them to return to Judea, or to Judea, and rebuild Solomon's temple that had been destroyed. So the Hebrews are a people with a sense of history. The Exodus movement itself is extremely important in that history. With the Jews, we see a new concept of time and of the future. No one knew what the future held, no one could predict it. But they knew that if they stayed faithful to their God, that they would eventually get through it. So the roots of the Hebrew faith would become eventually the basis for three of the world's greatest religions, all monotheistic. Of course, as we know, Judaism, which is the Hebrew faith. Out of Judaism is born two other monotheistic faiths. Of course, Christianity, because Jesus is seen as the fulfillment of the prophecy, the Hebrew prophecy for a Messiah to deliver the people of God. And even Islam. Now, Islam can trace its roots back to Judaism through Abraham as well. Okay, so Christians and Jews trace their lineage back to Abraham and his son Isaac. But Islam traces its roots back to Abraham through his illegitimate son that he had with his servant girl. That illegitimate son was Ishmael. We'll talk more about the faith of Islam when we get to that civilization in a later unit. But just so you know, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all seen as Abrahamic faiths. They all trace their roots to Abraham. Judaism and Christianity more closely related, of course, than Islam. Since Judaism and Christianity trace their lineage back to Isaac, the son of Abraham, the legitimate son of Abraham. Anyways, more than half of the world's population today practices one of these three ancient religions. Of the three, Judaism is the smallest now, but Christianity being the largest and Islam being the second largest. But interestingly enough, this small monotheistic faith eventually gives birth, if you will, to the three largest, religions in the world. Okay, or at least two of the largest religions in the world. Now let's move on to the Indus River Valley civilizations. Around 2500 BC, so we're going back in time again, we're starting back over to the beginning of settlements and those things in these river valleys. We see the people along the Indus River in northern India cultivating wheat, rice, yams, beans, peas, and bananas. This area had fertile land due to the Indus River and the silt that it deposited in the earth, okay, to rejuvenate that soil. They also domesticated sheep, goats, pigs, oxen, and chickens. The Indus River Valley was an extremely fertile region. As I said before, when the Indus River flooded, it deposited twice the silt that the Nile deposited. But unlike the Nile, the Indus River the flooding was unpredictable and oftentimes damaging because of that. So, as you can see, if you're doing a comparison, the silt is important to deposit in the soil. But if the rivers are not predictable, it's difficult to know when to plant and when to harvest. Same thing we saw with the Mesopotamian rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The unpredictability of them made it difficult for them to be able to plan their planting and their harvesting, and oftentimes led to famine. But in Egypt, that predictable annual flooding of the Nile made for very stable food production, and therefore a more stable society, not based on anxiety and pessimism, but a more optimistic society in general. The Harappan people, that was the first civilization along the Indus River, ultimately will build up their cities in this region using earthen walls and canals to control the flooding, to try to control that flooding, to be able to manage it better. This shows great ingenuity and engineering ability on behalf of the Harappan people. Now, the foundations of Harappan society, of course, the Indus River itself, that silt-enriched water from the mountain ranges of the Himalayas flowing down. It was a major society, the Harappan society, that was built by the Dravidian peoples. They're often sometimes known as the Harappan peoples as well, because of the city of Harappa that it's named after. Between 3000 and 2500 BC is when we see this Harappan society being built. It is believed that in the region, because of the fertile soil, they even started to cultivate cotton, even probably before this society was even built, around 5000 BC. There's evidence of early cultivation of cotton and of poultry in this general region. But the Harappan society declines after 1900 BC. The major cities were, of course, Harappa in the Punjab region and Mohenjo-Daro at the mouth of the Indus River. There were 70 smaller sites that were also excavated, but a total of tiny, tiny little villages also totaling up to 1,500. So the Harappan society, although there will be two major cities and 70 smaller sites, there will be actually over 1,500 little villages. And so this shows you a fairly well organized society. The characteristics of Harappan society, of course, the population in this region may be about 40,000 people, which is a fairly large population. The city of Harappa in that Punjab region was a regional center. The layout of the architecture of the ruins that have been found suggests public purposes to the architecture, town centers where trade could take place, broad streets, a citadel or a fortress for protection, walls built around the city. That's part of the citadel as well for protection, for defensive protection. Pools and sewage areas as well to take sewage out of the city and keep the city streets cleaner. That's pretty advanced if you think about it. There also seems to be evidence of standardized weights and measurements when looking at the writings left behind. Evidence that the trade, there were standardized weights and measurements throughout the region, not just in this one city, but the same kind of writings and record keeping was seen to in other areas in those smaller villages around the area as well. There seems to be specialized labor as well and trade. Harappan culture, of course, there's evidence of social stratification, meaning social classes, because there's different dwelling sizes, different decorations, some more highly ornate than others. The Harappan civilization does seem to have an influence on later Indian culture as well. Statues and figurines and illustrations from the period reflect a tradition of art and metallurgy that will be passed on to the later Indian populations. Venerated goddesses of fertility have been found as well. Now, of course, like we saw with Egypt and other Bronze Age civilizations, there seems to be a mysterious end to the Harappan civilization, too. The reasons for the disappearance are unclear. Perhaps there was excessive deforestation in the region that led to a loss of topsoil. And when the Indus River flooded, it finally washed away all of the good topsoil. Perhaps there were earthquakes in the region because of the Himalayan mountains being just to the north. Perhaps, since seismic activity could have caused a disappearance of the civilization. Perhaps there was too much flooding that didn't just deforest the area and wash away the topsoil, but wash away, whole cities. There's evidence of unburied dead that lead us to believe that people died suddenly and they were not able to bury their dead. So some kind of catastrophe seems to have happened. The disappearance of the Harappan civilization seems to be around 1500 BC, about 1,000 years after we see the beginning of it. But the Harappan traditions will survive. Agricultural practices, religious beliefs, and urban traditions will continue as the Aryan people conquer and come into this region and occupy India during the Iron Age. They will adopt many of the Harappan ways and adapt it to their own ways. And so this is where you once again see cultural diffusion. So the Aryan people who eventually become the new Indian civilization will adopt some of the old Harappan ways and adapt them to their Aryan ways. And you see a cultural blending as such that eventually manifests itself in things like the Hindu religion, a combination of both of those traditions together. Now, the early Aryans, they were a pastoral economy. Pastoral peoples, nomadic peoples, they herded sheep, goats, horses, and cattle, and they eventually moved from the areas around Tajikistan, Iran, Afghanistan, into Pakistan, and into India proper. They bring with them their own religious and literary traditions and works. The Vedas that you learned about in the World's Religion lecture are the four Vedas were the religious hymns and writings that they brought with them. Um, Veda means wisdom. The most important of the four Vedas was the Rig Veda, which is about 1,000 hymns to the Aryan gods that we know will be eventually incorporated with some of the Dravidian religious practices to become the basis of what will be the Hindu religion. This is when we start referring to this time as the Vedic age, after the Aryans have come in and taken over this area, and they establish a new civilization, and they refer to this time period, this is during the Iron Age, as the Vedic age. You will see that there are some conflicts between those Aryans who have infiltrated and the indigenous peoples, perhaps the ones that were left of the original Harappan civilization, the descendants of those original Dravidian peoples. They will be referred to by the Aryans as dasas, which means enemies or subjects. The Aryans want to keep themselves separate from those indigenous dasas, oftentimes treating them as if they are a second class society. The Aryans also established chiefdoms throughout India where they have these almost like small kingdoms where they are controlled by a chief or a raja. It's a kind of governing force, a king, if you will, for lack of a better word. The early concentration of the Aryans took place in that northern Punjab region, but they will eventually start migrating further south into, the subcontinent of India. Again, they bring with them the development of iron metallurgy, and you start to see an increasing reliance on agriculture. They leave some of their pastoral nomadic ways behind and start to adapt to the agricultural system that had been established in the Punjab region by the Harappan civilization earlier on. Adapt it and adopt it, cultural diffusion. Tribal connections also evolve into political structures eventually, with these rajas in charge, a social hierarchy and a political hierarchy. And you also see the development of their own writing system, the basis of which is what we now know as Sanskrit. Now, the caste system is something that the Aryans contribute to the Indian civilization. Okay, they bring this with them. It is known as the Varna. Okay, the caste system. The origins are in the Aryan domination over the Dravidian or indigenous peoples of India, the Dasas as they refer to them. And ultimately, the caste system is these social classes, but it's more than just that. You're born into your caste and you stay in your caste until you die. You can't marry outside of your caste, and they're supposed to be kept separate. The upper caste are known as the Brahmins, they're the priestly caste. Then you have the Kshatriyas, the warriors. You had the um, Vaishyas, I don't think I know if I pronounced that correctly, Vaishyas, the merchant class, and then you had the Shudras, the serfs underneath them, the regular peasants. And then even below that, you have the untouchables. Eventually, there will also be a jati system of subcastes. This does not happen until later on when we have urbanization happening, but that's something that we'll talk about in a later unit. Just know that the caste system was predominantly brought by the Aryans to try to keep themselves on top in the top castes and the Dravidian populations in the lower castes. The Chinese civilization in the Huanghe River Valley. Around 4000 BC, agricultural villages developed along China's Huanghe, also known as the Yellow River, in northeastern China. The Chinese grew millet, which is a small grain type of crop. They also grew rice, onions, and fruit, and they also domesticated pigs for protein. The Huanghe River is, like I say, also known as the Yellow River because of the yellowish silt that is left behind after the floodings happen. But unfortunately, the Huanghe River did not flood very predictably. It was very unpredictable, and it led China to start referring to the Huanghe as China's sorrow. The yellowish silt, also known as loess, left fields fertile, but if it flooded too heavily, instead of leaving the silt, it washed away not only the silt but also the topsoil, and could oftentimes lead to famine when that happened. So again, unpredictability of the rivers, that geographical determinism, okay, made people feel a bit uncertain about the future. And this sometimes is reflected in their religious practices as well. The Yellow River flooding, about over almost 15, almost 1600 floods are recorded in Chinese history. A big one in 1931 led to the death of 2.5 million people. That's the most recent one that we have in written history. 1887, there was one that killed 2 million people. Those two were the top two worst natural disasters in history in China. But there were many more before that, and especially many more before, real valid records were kept too. So these floodings did not just wash away topsoil, they also washed away whole cities and people, the people living in them. The Chinese built levees along the Huanghe River to try to help control the floods. Levees are kind of like little dams, if you will, to keep the rivers from being able to flood over into the cities. Um, Now, China will develop a very long history of how they govern themselves. It's a long history of dynastic rule. Dynastic rule is where a specific family would rule all or parts of China with power handed down from one generation to the next through the family. And you can see some of the most influential Chinese dynasties listed here on this visual. The dynastic cycle is an important thing to understand Chinese history. Chinese dynasties claimed the mandate of heaven was granted to them in order to have control over China. Okay, now the concept of heaven was not just a place where the deities lived. It was kind of seen as a universal creative force in the universe. And so the Chinese dynasties believed that they had been given the mandate of the creative force in the universe to have the rulership in this region. And thus this established the dynastic cycle as ruling families come and go. And this is kind of how it works. The dynasty is founded under a powerful leader who claims to have the mandate of heaven. And then oftentimes they go through a period of great power and prosperity. That dynasty is able to restore peace, restore glory to the country, sponsor building projects like roads and irrigation systems, improving the everyday life of the people in the dynasty in general. Then they will sometimes go through a period of decline. With a dynastic principle, it's the roll of the genetic dice who is going to be the next ruler. And sometimes you have good rulers, but sometimes you have poor rulers. And just because they're the next person in line for the throne doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good king. So oftentimes you see a period of decline under a series of weaker rulers, if you will. Higher taxes come about, social services decline, natural disasters can oftentimes usher in a period of decline as well. And this is where it's sometimes seen as the leader or the dynasty losing the mandate of heaven, which ultimately can lead to a period of rebellion where the dynasty is overthrown, perhaps by another family, another dynasty, who now claims to have the mandate of heaven and establish a new dynasty, and the cycle continues. So here we go. New dynasty comes to power. The emperor reforms the government, makes it more efficient. Lives the lives, of the common people are improved. Taxes reduced. Farming encouraged. Problems begin, extensive wars, invasions, maybe even natural disasters. Taxes increase, men forced to work for the army, farming is neglected. As a result, the government then has to increase spending on these wars. Oftentimes, this leads to corruption in that government. Droughts and floods and famines can also occur that can lead to problems as well, natural disasters. The poor lose respect for the government ultimately. They join the rebels and attack the landlords. I just see a typo. I'm sorry. Lose is spelled incorrectly. It's spelled like loose and it should be Lose, not Loose. Sorry for that typo. My fingers got away from me. The then rebel bands can find another strong leader who unites them to attack the emperor, and thus the emperor is defeated, and a new dynasty comes to power once again with the mandate of heaven. Here are some examples of the earliest of the Chinese dynasties: the Jia dynasty, 2000 BC, and the Shang dynasty between 1750 and 1045 BC. The Jia dynasty, very little is known about it. We just don't have a lot of artifacts from it. We don't have any writing from it, so we know very little about it. We do know that the Shang dynasty that comes next, we knew a lot more about them. The capital seems to be established in Anyang, established by the Shang family. That's why it's called the Shang dynasty. The realm was divided among the military men that were chosen by the king to govern it, and they answered to the king directly. Bronze metallurgy seems to have been a practice then. Large armies were kept. Political organization was fairly extensive. There was a network of fortified cities that ultimately answered back to the center, the capital, which was under the control of the king. Those fortified cities would be the ones that would be the military men that were chosen by the king to rule over them in the name of the king. So a bureaucracy of sorts. Ultimately, the Shang dynasty burial practices show that they had a hierarchical social structure, a well developed class system with upper, middle, lower classes as well. Now, when it comes to the earliest Chinese writing, we see from the Shang period things known as oracle bones. The oracle bones seem to be used for communicating with the spirit world. The Chinese seem to have more of a idea of spirits guiding, including the ancestors that have passed on before you, rather than specific deities. So this belief in spirits and forces. So the oracle bones were used to communicate with the spirit world to help determine the path one should take in the future. Early archaeological evidence of Chinese writing has been found on these oracle bones. It is believed that they would take these old bones, usually from animals, just so you know, and they would take heated metal rods, stick them into the bones, and when cracks were made in the bone from the heat, those cracks would then be interpreted by priests, and oftentimes they form themselves into what seem to be the earliest versions of Chinese characters. Okay, if you look on the right side of the picture there. Now, really what it all boils down to in Chinese society, in these earliest civilizations, is recognizing the importance of family and patriarchy. Just like you studied before in an earlier unit when we were looking at their world religions and philosophies, we know that the Chinese believed in spirits. They believed in forces in the universe more so than deities. They believed in the importance of family. They believed in the importance of one's ancestors that have gone on before them. This is all boiled down into the concept of Zhao, or filial piety, the devotion to family, the veneration of one's ancestors, asking one's ancestors to give you guidance and help you to make decisions about your future. The father, of course, is seen as the ritual head of all family rites, and he's the center of the society. Just as the emperor watches over the entire the entire state, the entire nation, the father watches over his family. And those five key relationships that you learned about in Confucianism, okay, those five key relationships, which show every person in Chinese society has a duty to other people. As long as those duties and that five key relationships are maintained, all will be well in Chinese society. That becomes the heart of Chinese society. Ultimately, if anybody wants to if anybody wants to try to help remember this, of course you know that this is incorporated in the story of Mulan. Looking to one's ancestors for guidance before going off and making a big decision that impacts the family and those kinds of things. So the father is the ritual head of family rites. The emperor is the center of society, who is sort of like the father of the entire state. This importance of devotion to family and respect for one's elders and even venerating one's ancestors is at the heart of Chinese society. And it all begins in these early Bronze Age Chinese societies, the Shang dynasty in particular, and it will carry through the rest of Chinese history.